Applied anthropology. I got 10 minutes. We're doing good. Applied anthropology would be things like cultural resource management, where you locate sites of prehistoric and historic interest and you try to preserve them. We have a lot of these in the United States. In California, you'll see like little brass markers as you drive down the highway. And they could be preserving anything from stagecoach tracks that came across the desert to an old historic inn or maybe burial site. And this is part of what an anthropologist could do for a living. Another would be contract archaeology. In 1966, the National Historical Preservation Act was passed, and this is where we attempt to preserve the nation's history and past. And so you could actually be hired on as a consultant or an evaluator of certain sites. Medical anthropology. This is the interaction between health, nutrition, social environment, and cultural beliefs. So for example, in Jewish and Islamic cultures, they have very strict diets associated with their religion and their cultural beliefs. And a medical anthropologist or a nutritional anthropologist would be looking to see, is there a connection between their cultural beliefs about food, like what's clean, what's unclean, what's halal, and what's not, and well-being and thriving. We might look at people in Japan, right, who have a high diet of seafood or seaweed, kelp, mostly a vegetarian diet. Does that have an impact? Their beliefs, their culture, with their physical well-being. Another would be developmental anthropology. And this is where governments and corporations use anthropology to help problem solve and avoid conflicts. I mean, imagine how much better our diplomacy and things would be if you understand the culture that you're interacting with. Because in some cultures, you could end up offending them simply out of ignorance. For example, in many Middle Eastern countries, the right hand is clean, the left hand is unclean. So if you try to shake someone with your left hand, you're already off to insulting them before you've even begun the conversation, right? And so it's really helpful if you have an anthropologist to come in and explain to you some of the norms, some of the culture, some of the values of the people you're trying to interact with. Educational anthropology. This is where you observe, record, and analyze human behavior. You look for and understand cultural assumptions, values, and beliefs that underline behavior. And this could be incredibly helpful. Like some of you are thinking of going into education or being teachers. If you don't understand the difference between like your Chaldean kids, your Southeast Asian kids, your white Anglo-suburban kids, that's going to be a problem, right? You could end up inadvertently doing things that was very offensive to those students or their parents, even though from your worldview or your culture, you were being quite appropriate and sensitive. And so it's really helpful whether you're in business, in government, in education, or even just living in California where we have so many diverse cultures, to learn enough about other groups so you know if you're being offensive or not. I mean, you're not doing it simply because you don't know any better. And that's I'm also part of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee here at the school. And I've done a lot of surveys in the last couple years. And for the most part, at least the feedback I've gotten, I haven't sensed a really strong feeling that there's overt prejudice or discrimination here at the school. Like, people aren't just coming flat out and saying really hateful, racist, or disparaging ethnic things to one another. But what does happen is people will ask questions or they'll say things that are really ignorant, and they can be really hurtful. And so part of what I'm trying to do with not just the students, but also with faculty and staff, is to help educate people more about different cultures. I mean, like, you don't touch a black woman's hair. But if you're not from black culture or society, that may not be something you intuitively or instinctively know. And these are things we have to learn and share about each other. In some cultures, you don't touch another person. You respect that personal space. Or it might be gender related. You don't have physical contact with someone that's not in your family or a close relative. And so these are all really helpful things if you plan to travel or if you plan to live among other human beings that are not the same as yourself. So cultural anthropology today. In the past, part of, like, if you were getting a master's degree in anthropology, you would go out, and your dissertation or master's thesis would be actually going out, living with another culture, and then writing up a report about them, and then adding that to the catalog of our knowledge of different people groups and cultures around the world. Well, here we are in the early part of the 21st century, and there are very few, there may be a few out there who undiscovered people groups or ethnic groups, but for the most part, the people of the world have been researched, studied, categorized, written about. So many modern day anthropologists who are doing their master's work are now focusing on subcultures, because subcultures are arising all the time. We get subcultures popping up as a reaction to the broad cultures they're living in. And I gave you a few examples, I think, our first week of class. Here in Southern California, we have subcultures like surfer subculture, right? We got the bro subculture in East County with the flat bill hats and the big jacked up trucks. We've got steampunks. We've got lots of fusion like Chicano culture, right? These little subcultures that aren't like typical mainstream Mexican culture, but they're like these little subgroups within those cultures. And think about how diverse, like, Hispanics are, not just in the United States, but in the Latin world or the Latino world. And I think it's really helpful and interesting, and that's what I would encourage you to do in this class when you do your field work. You're welcome to do a major culture, but I'm super interested in these subcultures or even countercultures that arise over time. All right. So here's some of the perspectives the book is going to point out. One is a holistic perspective. This is where you look at connections and interrelations between human beings, things, and how the parts interrelate to the whole. I saw there was a really neat book at Barnes & Noble. It was called Material Culture. And in this book, they were simply looking at the physical material differences between different people groups. And so they might have some Bedouins from Saudi Arabia bring everything out from their tents and put it in front so you can see what they have. And then they might go to suburban Illinois outside of Chicago and have their family from the suburb do the same thing. And then they might do it in Peru or China. And it was a really interesting way to look at culture. But instead of just taking the material, what about their ideas, their concepts, their values, their beliefs? And a holistic approach would say you can't just look at the physical or the ideological, but you have to put them together if you really want to understand, hence the word holism. And I think that's a wise approach. We have comparativism, and that's what cultural relativism does. It generalizes about humans, but it must take the full range of cultural diversity into account. And so we talked about cultural relativism is descriptive, and that's what the book's going to do. Ethical relativism is prescriptive. It tells you how you ought to behave. And then finally we have situational relativism, which is kind of like moral relativism or circumstantial ethics. And we already talked about ethnocentrism the first class, but that's my last word to end on. So my goal with you in this class is, by learning about other cultures and your own culture, that it will help you be less ethnocentric. And ethnocentrism is like racism, but instead of judging people based on their genetics, you're judging them based on what they have been taught. And so we're going to try to help you avoid ethnocentrism. It doesn't mean you can't critique and evaluate other cultures, but it will hopefully get you away from blindly stereotyping or categorizing or labeling other people simply because they're not like you. All right. Thanks for joining me for chapter 1.